There's a moment right before you sign the last page of a $2.5 million real estate contract when the room goes completely quiet, not because anything changed, but because you feel something shift deep in your chest, like a door closing on one version of your life and opening onto something you can't see yet. I felt that on a Tuesday morning in September, sitting across from our attorney, Gerald Hawthorne, at his office on Water Street in Charlottesville, Virginia. The papers were spread across the mahogany desk. The air smelled like leather and old carpet. My husband Timothy, 71 years old, gray at the temples, steady as a clock, sat right beside me with his reading glasses on and his hands flat on the table. He didn't look nervous. He never looks nervous. That's the thing about Timothy that I still marvel at after 44 years of marriage. While the world spins, he stays still. I signed my name 11 times. Each time the pen touched the paper, I thought about the 32 years we had spent on that property. The old colonial on Sycamore Ridge Road with the wraparound porch and the 4-car garage and the half-acre garden I'd kept every spring since 1991. I thought about the magnolia tree in the side yard that our daughter Ruth crashed her bicycle into when she was 9. I thought about the kitchen where my son Alan burned every batch of Christmas cookies he ever tried to make. I thought about the basement where Susan practiced her school choir songs so long into the night that Timothy would fall asleep on the couch upstairs just to be closer to the sound of her voice. $2.5 million. That's what 32 years of mortgage payments, renovations, a new roof in 2017, a full kitchen remodel, and a lifetime of upkeep became on paper. Gerald slid the final document across the table. Congratulations, Mrs. Best, that's a remarkable sale. I shook his hand, I smiled, and then Timothy asked Gerald to give us 5 minutes alone. Gerald stepped out and closed the door, and Timothy reached into the inside pocket of his sport coat and pulled out a piece of yellow legal paper, folded in thirds, worn at the creases like he'd opened and closed it many times. He unfolded it and set it on the table in front of me. It was a list, 12 years of dates, dollar amounts, names, our children's names. Ruth, $94,000. Alan, $107,500. Susan, $79,000.
That's what we've given them in 12 years. Cash, paid credit cards, covered rent, co-signed loans, handed over envelopes at Christmas that were never once called what they were. $280,000. And not one of them has called this week to ask how we're doing since we listed the house.
The room was quiet. The air conditioning clicked on somewhere in the ceiling. I've been watching for a long time, Nancy. His voice was calm, not angry. Timothy rarely gets angry, just certain, the way he sounds when he's already made up his mind about something that matters. And I need to know the truth before we move $1 of this money. I need to know who our children actually are. I looked at the list, at Alan's number, at Ruth's, at Susan's, which was the smallest but still added up to nearly $80,000 that I could barely remember spending because each piece of it had come with a reason that sounded so urgent at the time. What do you want to do?
I want you to call them today, all 3, and I want you to tell them we went bankrupt. Tell them the estate sold for far less than the debt. Tell them the bank took the difference. Tell them we have nothing left.
I sat with that for a long moment. And if they prove you wrong, I said, if they come running over with food and kindness and ask us to move in with them. Timothy folded the paper back into thirds and put it in his coat pocket. Then I'll drive you to each of their houses myself to apologize. I'll get down on my knees if I have to. He looked at me over his reading glasses. But I don't think that's what happens. I wanted him to be wrong. I want you to understand that. I did not sit in that chair hoping my children would fail some test. I sat there praying Timothy had miscounted, that the list was off, that there was some explanation I hadn't thought of. I picked up my pen and signed the last line. We walked out of Gerald Hawthorne's office into a warm September morning, $2.5 million richer, and about to tell our children we had nothing. Timothy held my hand the whole way to the car. That's the thing about a man who is truly wise. He doesn't need to be loud about it. He doesn't shout or argue or demand. He simply lays the truth on the table and waits for the room to catch up to him. I've been married to Timothy Best for 44 years. I know that look, that patience, that quiet that means he's already thought through what you haven't gotten to yet. And standing in that parking lot, squinting into the September sun, I understood something I hadn't let myself see before. Timothy hadn't made that list this week. He hadn't started tracking our children's requests recently. That list had been building for 12 years. He had been watching, quietly, carefully, the way good men do, not to punish, but to protect. I took a breath, I got in the car, and on the drive home, I started thinking about what I was going to say to my daughters and my son when I called them that afternoon. I thought I knew what would happen. I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes before I dialed the first number. The kitchen was familiar, same round oak table we'd had for 15 years, same window above the sink that looked out onto the magnolia tree, same blue jay that came every afternoon to argue with the squirrels at the bird feeder. Everything looked normal, everything was about to change. I called Ruth first because she's the oldest and because in a family you start with the one you think is steadiest. Ruth is 38. She works in commercial real estate in Richmond, a good job, a nice townhouse, a husband named Craig who sells insurance and coaches their son's little leg team. From the outside, Ruth's life looks solid. And she's always carried herself like the responsible one, the dependable daughter, the one who sends birthday texts on time and shows up to family dinners without being reminded twice. She answered on the second ring, "Mom." Hey, slightly distracted, I could hear her clicking through something on a computer. "What's up, Ruth, honey? I need to tell you something and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." The clicking stopped. I took a breath. The estate sale didn't go the way we expected. The buyer's financing fell through at the last minute and we had to renegotiate. The final sale price barely covered what we owed on the equity line and the back taxes on the property. After Gerald's fees, we walked away with almost nothing. Silence. "Ruth, how much is almost nothing?" Her voice had changed, quicker, tighter. We're not in a position to stay in the house and we don't have much in reserves right now. We're going to have to figure out next steps." Another pause. I counted 4 seconds. I know because I was watching the second hand on the kitchen clock. "Mom, what about the jewelry?" I gripped the edge of the table. "What, Grandma Aloysa's jewelry? The pieces you always said you'd pass down. Is that part of the estate assets? Could they come after that too?" I didn't answer right away. Ruth's first question when told her parents were broke was about the jewelry. Not, "Are you okay, Mom?" Not, "Where will you and Dad go?" Not, "What can I do to help?" The jewelry. "I don't know yet," I said, keeping my voice even. "Everything is still being sorted." "Well, you should talk to a different attorney if Gerald couldn't protect those assets. Craig knows someone who..." She paused. "Actually, let me talk to Craig." "We'll figure out who you need to call." She was already clicking again. "Keep me posted, Mom. I have a showing in 20 minutes. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there a moment, then I dialed Alan. Alan is 35. He lives in Roanoke with his girlfriend, Melissa, and their 2 dogs. He works in it for a regional logistics company, smart kid, always has been, and he has my mother's dark eyes and Timothy's stubborn jaw. We've always been close in the easy way that mothers and sons sometimes are, not dramatic, just comfortable. He calls on Sundays. He fixes things around our house when he visits. But Alan also borrowed $107,500 from us over 12 years. And not once did he use the word loan first. He answered on the first ring. "Mom, hey. Dad said you guys might call today. How'd the closing go?" Timothy had not spoken to Alan. We hadn't told anyone it was closing day. "It didn't go the way we hoped," I said. I gave him the same explanation I'd given Ruth. Alan was quiet then. "Okay, so how bad is it really? Like, is Dad's life insurance up to date? Would that cover things if..." He stopped himself. I felt something cold move through me. "If what, Alan?" "Nothing. I just, if something were to happen, I want to make sure you're both covered." Timothy was 71 and in good health. He'd had a physical 3 months ago. Dr. Feldstein had called him disgustingly fit for his age. My son, hearing that his parents were broke, had asked about his father's life insurance. "Everything is in order," I said. "Good, good," he exhaled. "Well, let me know if there's anything you need." Melissa and I have been pretty stretched this month, but obviously family comes first. Melissa and I have been stretched. I filed that sentence away. "Of course," I said. "I'll keep you posted." I hung up. I looked at the magnolia tree outside the window. One of the branches had started to turn, just the tips, early for September, but there it was. The first sign of something letting go. I called Susan last. Susan is 34, the youngest, and in many ways the one I worried about most, not because she was troubled, but because she'd always needed things from me in ways she couldn't name. Validation, reassurance. A check at the end of the month when her budget ran short. She answered, and I could hear the television in the background, one of those afternoon home renovation programs. I told her the same story. There was a long pause. The television cut to a commercial. "Okay," she said finally, "just okay. Susan, Mom, another pause. You know that monthly thing you do, the grocery deposit you put in our account? The $200? Yes. Should I cancel that? Like if you're not going to have it? $200 a month." That's what Susan's mind went to. Not "come over, Mom." Not "are you scared, Mom?" Not "I love you, Mom. Cancel the grocery deposit." I heard the television switch back to the renovation program. A host was talking about the importance of a solid foundation. "I'll let you know," I said. "Okay. Love you too." I set the phone down on the table. The kitchen was very quiet. The blue jay had flown away from the bird feeder. The magnolia branch with the turning tips moved slightly in the breeze. Timothy walked in from the living room. He'd been in there the whole time, not eavesdropping, just close. He looked at my face. He didn't say "I told you so." He didn't say anything at all. He went to the counter, poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of me, and sat down. We sat there together until the cups were empty. I wouldn't have known about the group chat if it hadn't been for Carol Whitmore. Carol is 61 and lives 4 houses down from where we used to live on Sycamore Ridge Road. She's a retired high school librarian with a sharp mind, a kind heart, and the memory of an elephant for detail. Ruth had gone to UVA with Carol's daughter, Patris. They'd been close for a few years and drifted apart the way college friendships do. But Carol had always been fond of our family. She used to wave from her porch when I pulled weeds in the yard. She brought soup when Timothy had his appendix out in 2019. Carol called me on a Thursday evening, 3 days after my phone calls to the children. She asked if I had a minute to talk. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Nancy, I need to ask you something, and I hope it doesn't overstep. Ruth added me to a group chat this week. I think by mistake. She probably still had my number from when the girls were in school together. I don't think she realized I was in there." I waited. "I read some of it before I realized what it was," Carol said carefully, "and I didn't feel right staying silent, so I'm going to read you what I saw, and then I'm going to remove myself from the group. And what you do with it is entirely your business." Carol read me 11 messages. She read them slowly and steadily, the way she must have read to children in the library for 30 years. No drama, just the words exactly as written. Ruth had started the chat 2 hours after I'd called her. She titled it "Family Situation." Ruth said, "Mom called, says they lost everything on the estate sale. Dad hasn't said anything yet. We need to talk," Alan said. "I called Uncle Phil to see if there's any way to verify what she's saying. He said the sale is public record." Ruth said, "Look it up then. We need to know the actual number before we do anything." Susan said, "Does this mean we lose the inheritance?" Ruth said, "We don't know yet. That's why we need to be smart right now." Alan said, "If Dad is still healthy, we have time. The house is gone, but what about the retirement accounts? Those would go through probate differently." Ruth said, "His pension from Beaumont Engineering should still be there. We need to find out what Mom has in her name separately." Susan said, "What if they need to go into assisted living sooner than expected? Could we be responsible for that financially?" Alan said, "No, not if we don't co-sign anything. We should not co-sign anything." Ruth said, "Agreed, don't co-sign. And nobody offer money we don't have. We need to protect ourselves first." Susan said, "Should someone call and check on them?" Ruth said, "I'll send a card." I sat with the phone against my ear and said nothing for a long moment after Carol finished reading. A card. Ruth was going to send a card, not visit, not call back, not say, "I'm coming over, Mom, I'll bring dinner," a card. And the thing that struck me most wasn't the coldness of it, it was the precision. Alan looking up the public record. Ruth already thinking about probate rules and pension structures. Susan asking whether they'd be financially liable if Timothy and I needed care. These were not the panicked messages of people who just heard their parents were struggling. These were the calculated responses of people who'd always treated us, somewhere in the back of their minds, as a financial asset they were managing. I thanked Carol. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped I was all right. I told her I was. I think she knew I wasn't, but she was too kind to press. I hung up and went to find Timothy. He was on the back porch reading. He reads every evening, has for as long as I can remember, usually history books with titles that sound like college courses. He looked up when the screen door opened. I told him everything. Every message, word for word as best I could remember. His expression didn't change much. There was a slight tightening around his eyes. That's how Timothy shows you something hurt him, not dramatics, just that small tightening, like he's bracing against wind. The pension, he said quietly when I finished. They already found the pension. Alan found it 2 hours after I called. Timothy looked out at the backyard, the empty bird bath, the late September garden winding down, the old oak tree at the property line we'd never gotten around to trimming. You know what that tells me? I waited. They've thought about this before, he said. This wasn't research they started tonight. You don't know where to look for a pension structure and probate rules in 2 hours unless some part of you has already been wondering about those things. I sat down in the other chair. The evening air had the cool edge that comes to Virginia in late September, the kind of cool that doesn't feel like fall yet but lets you know it's coming. They haven't called back, I said. It's been 3 days, I know. Susan asked about the grocery deposit. I heard. Alan asked about your life insurance. I know. He turned the page of his book even though I don't think he was reading. Ruth is going to send a card. We sat there for a few minutes without speaking. Are you angry? I asked. Timothy thought about that. No, he said. I'm sad. There's a difference. He set the book down in his lap. Angry is what you feel when someone surprises you. I'm not surprised, Nancy. I've been watching this for a long time. What I feel is sadness for them, for what it means about who they've let themselves become. He paused. And a little bit for us, for all the years we kept hoping we were seeing it wrong. I reached over and put my hand on top of his. His knuckles are getting a bit arthritic. He won't say so, but I can see it in the mornings. He turned his hand over and held mine. We're not done, he said. This is just the part where we find out the truth. The next part is ours to decide. I believed him. I have always believed him. That is the bedrock of 44 years. We sat on the porch until the light faded completely and the stars came out over the oak tree. They came within 10 days, not together, that would have been too obvious even for them, but one after another, spaced out just enough to look natural. Alan arrived first. He drove up on a Saturday morning in his gray Honda Civic, dressed casually, jeans, a fleece vest, the kind of weekend look that says I'm just stopping by. He hugged me at the door. He shook Timothy's hand. He said things like, just wanted to check on you guys, and Melissa sends her love, and so sorry you're going through this. We sat in the living room with coffee, and then I watched my son's eyes begin to move. It was subtle. You'd miss it if you weren't looking. A glance at the corner cabinet where I keep my mother's china. A look toward the hallway, as if measuring how much furniture a hallway could hold. His gaze traveling to the built-in bookshelves Timothy made by hand in 1998, as if calculating what Goodwood might be worth. He didn't say anything outright. Alan is careful with words, always has been. But he asked, over the second cup of coffee, whether we had thought about what to do with some of the bigger pieces, whether we knew anyone who handled estate sales, whether we had receipts for the grandfather clock in the front hall. For insurance purposes, he said. Of course, I said. Timothy sat in his armchair the entire visit and said approximately 4 things. How's work? How are the dogs? Thank you for coming, son. Drive safe. He watched Alan the same way he watches a weather report, calmly, noting everything, storing it. After Alan left, I stood at the kitchen window and watched his car back down the driveway. Neither Timothy nor I spoke for a moment. The grandfather clock, Timothy said finally. Yes, my father's clock, I know. He picked up his coffee and finished it. Okay. Susan came 4 days later with her husband Derek. Derek is 37, works in logistics, and has the particular confidence of a man who has never had to work very hard for anything because he married someone whose parents quietly subsidized his life without him fully acknowledging it. He's not a bad person. I've never thought Derek was bad, but he is oblivious in the special way that money blindness creates, where you simply don't notice the resources around you because they've always been there. Susan hugged me a long time at the door, longer than usual. I held on to her and tried to read the hug. Was it real worry or practiced performance? I honestly couldn't tell. That's what these weeks had done to me. I'd lost the ability to accept things at face value from the people I loved most. They sat in the living room. Derek, within 7 minutes, said, "Have you thought about what to do with the property if you end up needing to downsize again? Like this house, how much equity do you have here?" Derek. Susan said his name softly, the way she does when she wants him to stop without making a scene. He shrugged. "I'm just asking. It's a practical question." "It's fine," I said, because I'd learned that there's a kind of information gathering you can do when you let people talk. "We've been looking at our options." "What about assisted living?" Derek said. Because I've read that waiting lists in Virginia can be years long, and if you wait too long, Derek, Susan again, what? They should be thinking about this. It's responsible. Timothy from his armchair. We're thinking about it. Derek nodded, apparently satisfied. He helped himself to another of the shortbread cookies I'd put out and looked around the living room with the calm assessment of someone walking through a property listing. The visit lasted 90 minutes. They brought flowers, a gas station bouquet, the kind with the slightly wilted carnations that nobody picks out carefully. Susan hugged me again at the door. Derek shook Timothy's hand and said, "Hang in there, Tim," with a firmness that seemed to indicate that he felt good about this interaction. They left. I sat back down. Timothy hadn't moved. "Assisted living," I said. "He wanted to know the timeline," Timothy said. "He wasn't asking out of concern. He was calculating when the next round of assets becomes available." I looked at my hands in my lap. "Timothy, this is our family. I know, it's still our family even if it will always be our family," he said, gently interrupting. "That doesn't change. What changes is what we do with the information." He looked at me over his reading glasses. "We love them, Nancy. We will always love them. But love is not the same as blind trust. You can love someone and still see them clearly." Ruth came a week after that, no Craig. She came alone, dressed as if she'd just come from showing a property, blazer, heels, a leather bag that probably cost more than a week of groceries. She didn't bring anything. Not flowers, not food, not even a card, though she'd promised to send one. She sat at the kitchen table and talked for 40 minutes about her feelings regarding the situation, about how this had been stressful for her, about how she hoped Timothy and I had thought carefully about our options, and how she would have appreciated more communication earlier so she could have helped plan, about how other families handle these transitions, about what we were planning to do with the kitchen table. It was an antique, she mentioned. Had we had it appraised? When she left, she squeezed my hand at the door and said, "Hang in there, Mom. You're stronger than you think." I thanked her. I closed the door. I went to the kitchen table, the antique Ruth had her eye on, and I sat down in the chair I have sat in for 32 years, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. My children had come to my house in the week after learning I was broke. Not one of them had brought a meal. Not one of them had said, "Do you need us to take anything off your plate?" Not one of them had asked if I was sleeping, if I was eating, if the worry was keeping me up at night. They had come to assess. And the man who was still in his armchair in the living room, reading his history book, making no demands of anyone, that man had known exactly what would happen. He'd seen it 12 years ago. He had just waited for me to see it too. It was a Wednesday afternoon, about 2.5 weeks after the phone calls, when I heard a car slow down in front of the house and then a door close carefully, the way younger drivers do when they're still being cautious. I looked out the window. It was Lily. Lily is Susan and Derek's daughter. She's 16, a junior at Turner High School in Roanoke, where she plays clarinet in the marching band and volunteers on Saturday mornings at the Rescue Mission Food Pantry. She is Susan's brown eyes and Derek's height, and somehow, despite both of them, she got a quality that belonged entirely to herself, a kind of quiet attentiveness. The way she listens when you talk, the way she notices the thing you didn't say. She came up the porch steps with a reusable grocery bag over one shoulder and knocked on the door even though she's been in this house 100 times and knows she doesn't have to knock. I opened the door. She had a little pot of yellow mums from the hardware store, the kind you put on a porch. A box of my brand of chamomile tea, the specific brand, the one in the orange box. A loaf of the sourdough from Greenway Bakery on 5th that I've been buying for 15 years. "Hi, Grandma," she held out the bag. "I didn't know if you needed anything, so I just brought a few things." I took the bag. I didn't trust my voice immediately, so I just stepped aside to let her in. She came in and sat at the kitchen table while I put the kettle on. She didn't look around at the furniture. She didn't ask about the clock in the hall or the china cabinet or what we planned to do with anything. She sat with her hands folded on the table and asked how I was sleeping, not how are you managing. Not have you figured out your finances, how are you sleeping? Not great, I admitted. I thought so, she said. You look tired, thank you for noticing. Mom doesn't know I came, she said without apology. I told her I was at Abby's. I'll tell her the truth later. I wanted to come before she could say not to. I turned to look at her from the counter. Did you think she'd say not to come? Lily thought about that honestly. I don't know, maybe. Lately things are kind of, she pressed her lips together. Mom and Dad have been stressed, talking about money a lot, and I just kept thinking about you and Grandpa and nobody was saying anything about coming to see you. So I came, the kettle started to hum. Lily, I said, can I ask you something? Sure. When your mom told you what happened, that we'd lost the estate, what was the first thing you thought? She didn't hesitate. I thought, are they scared? Because I'd be really scared. I poured the water over the tea bags. I brought both cups to the table. I sat down across from my granddaughter and I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in maybe a year, the way you sometimes stop actually seeing the people who are always around. She was 16 years old. She had her babysitting money and her Saturday food pantry shifts and her clarinet case in the car, and she had driven 40 minutes from Roanoke on a Wednesday afternoon because she thought her grandparents might be scared. She hadn't asked what was in the will. We were scared, I told her. We are a little, but we're going to be all right. I know you will, she said. Grandpa always figures things out. She wrapped both hands around the tea mug. And you're tough, Grandma. You don't know you are, but you are. I didn't say anything. I looked at the yellow mums she'd set on the counter, that cheerful, ordinary little pot of flowers from the hardware store, and I thought about how much more they meant than the gas station carnations Susan and Derek had brought. It's not the size of a gesture, it's whether the person behind it actually thought about you when they made it. Lily had remembered my tea brand, she'd remembered the bakery. She had thought about me specifically, not parents in general, not grandmother as category, but me. Timothy came in from the back porch and found us at the table. His face when he saw Lily, I will carry that look for the rest of my life. It was the face of a man who'd been waiting to be proven right about something painful and was relieved instead to be proven right about something good. He sat down with us, he asked about the clarinet, he asked about her friend Abby, he asked about the food pantry, and she lit up talking about a new sorting system the director was trying. They talked for an hour. I mostly just listened. When Lily got up to leave, she hugged us both at the door. Timothy held on a beat longer than usual. After she drove away, we stood on the porch together watching the dust settle on the driveway. She came on her own, I said. She came on her own, Timothy agreed. We went back inside. I put the mums on the kitchen windowsill where the sun would hit them in the morning. I made a second cup of tea. That evening, Timothy made a phone call. I didn't ask who to. He stayed on for about 20 minutes, speaking quietly in the study with the door not quite closed. I heard him say Lily's name twice. When he came back to the living room, he sat down in his armchair and picked up his book. Did you call the attorney? I asked. He looked at me over his reading glasses with that expression, that slight, steady expression that means he's 5 steps ahead and he knows I'm starting to catch up. I made a note, was all he said. I understood. Some things get remembered. Some things get documented. Timothy had decided that Lily, one act of real love in a month full of calculations, was worth remembering in a way that would last. Timothy chose a Sunday evening 6 weeks after the phone calls. He asked me to invite the children for dinner, all 3 of them with their spouses. He said, a family dinner, nothing formal, just to reconnect. He asked me to make the pot roast that the kids had grown up eating, and to set the table in the dining room, which we don't do often anymore, just for holidays and the occasional Sunday when we want things to feel right. I did all of it. I cooked for most of Sunday afternoon. The house smelled like browned meat and rosemary, and the dinner rolls I've been making the same way for 40 years. On the surface, it looked like nothing had changed. It looked like a normal family Sunday. They all came. Ruth and Craig, Alan by himself. He and Melissa had apparently had a disagreement that weekend, though he didn't say so directly. Susan and Derek. No Lily, too young for a parents and children dinner. They'd decided on their own. I noticed things as they came in. The way Ruth scanned the dining room quickly, checking, I think, to see if anything had been removed or sold. The way Alan's handshake with Timothy was slightly stiff. The way Susan was quieter than usual, which for Susan, who talks easily about anything, meant something was sitting on her chest. We ate. Pot roast, rolls, the green beans the way they like them with the bacon crumbled in. The conversation moved through safe territory. Alan's job, Craig's little leg team, the weather shifting toward winter. Normal talk. The kind of family generates on automatic when everyone is being careful, and then Timothy cleared his throat and set his fork down. The table went quiet. It happens whenever Timothy makes that particular gesture. It's not commanding exactly. It's just that after 44 years, I know what it means, and I think the children have learned it too. He does it when he has something real to say. He reached to the side, he'd placed a folder on the corner of the hutch before dinner, and he set it on the table in front of him. I want to have an honest conversation, he said. His voice was exactly the same as always, even, measured. There was no anger in it. I'm going to show you some numbers and say a few things, and I'm going to ask you to hear me out before anyone speaks. He opened the folder. Inside was the list from the attorney's office, the same yellow legal paper, now typed out cleanly and printed, and underneath it, a second page, a third, statements, records. A summary prepared, I would find out later, with the help of our accountant, Patrick Stearns, who has done our taxes for 22 years. Timothy set the first page in the center of the table. In 12 years, he said, your mother and I have given this family $280,000. This page breaks it down by recipient, date, and purpose as best we could reconstruct. He let that sit for a moment. Not 1 cent of that was ever called a loan by you. Not 1 cent was ever repaid or offered to be repaid. In a few cases, the request came within weeks of a purchase or a trip that your mother or I later saw on social media. Ruth opened her mouth. Timothy held up one hand gently. I asked you to hear me out. She closed her mouth. Craig put his hand on her arm. We sold the estate, Timothy continued, for $2.5 million. The sale was legitimate. The attorneys were legitimate. The money is real. He set the second page on top of the first. It is now in an irrevocable trust. Your mother and I are the trustees and beneficiaries. The structure is clean and it is final. He looked around the table, at each of them. Ruth's jaw was tight. Alan's face had gone carefully blank. He'd get to what he was feeling later in private. Susan's eyes filled with tears. We told you we went bankrupt, Timothy said, because we needed to see who you would be when you thought there was nothing left to take care of yourselves with, because that is when character shows up. Not at Christmas when the envelopes are fat, but when the answer to what can I get is nothing. He closed the folder. He folded his hands on top of it. I am not angry, he said. I want to be clear about that. I love each one of you. That is not in question tonight, and it will not be in question. But I am done pretending that what has been happening in this family is normal, or is love, or is the kind of relationship I am willing to continue without honesty. He paused. When your mother called to tell you she was broke, your first questions were about jewelry and life insurance and whether the grocery deposit was going to continue. Not one of you asked if she was all right. Not one of you came with a meal or offered your spare room. You came later individually and you looked at the furniture. Susan made a sound, not a word, just a sound. Her hand went over her mouth. That is the truth, Timothy said. I'm not saying it to wound you. I'm saying it because I believe you are capable of better. But I also need you to understand, the trust is structured as it is, and it will remain that way. Your mother and I will be taken care of. We don't need anyone to manage that for us. He looked at me. I nodded. He picked up his fork and went back to his pot roast as if he'd simply commented on the weather. The table was silent for a long moment. Then Ruth said, That's not fair. You deceived us. Timothy looked at her. We showed you a situation and watched how you responded. Deception is when you lie to take something from someone. We lied to find out who you are. Those are different things, Ruth. She looked at Craig. He said nothing. He was looking at the folder. Alan pushed back from the table. Not rudely, he didn't slam anything. He just quietly stood up, said, I need some air, and went out through the kitchen door onto the back porch. I heard the door close softly. Susan was crying, real tears, not performance. Something about the honesty of her grief in that moment told me this was true. I didn't know I was that person, she said, quietly, almost to herself. I looked at her mom. She looked up at me. I didn't know. I reached across the table and I covered her hand with mine, not because everything was fine, not because there wasn't work to do, but because she had said the truest thing anyone at that table had said all night, and I wasn't going to let it go unacknowledged. Timothy saw it. He said nothing. He let the moment be what it was. The dinner ended quietly. Plates were cleared, goodbyes were said without the usual warmth, but also without cruelty. Alan came back in from the porch, hugged me briefly, shook Timothy's hand, and left without explaining what he was feeling. Ruth and Craig left with a kind of tight formality, Ruth not quite meeting my eyes at the door. Susan was the last to leave. She stood on the porch for a moment and looked at me. I'm going to do better, she said. I believed her enough to hope she meant it. That's all you can do sometimes. Hope that the truth lands in the right soil. The week after that Sunday dinner was the quietest week we'd had in years. No calls from Ruth, no messages from Alan. A single text from Susan on Monday that said, thinking about what Dad said. That was all. No follow-up question, no request, just 4 words. I didn't know whether to read that as progress or retreat. I found out through Carol Whitmore, who has become, in these weeks, something of an unexpected lifeline, that Ruth had consulted a family attorney about the trust. Not to contest it, the attorney apparently told her, because an irrevocable trust is exactly what the name says. But she'd asked. She'd sat across from a lawyer and asked whether there was any way in. There wasn't. Timothy had made certain of that. Carol told me this with gentleness, the way she tells me everything like she's handing me something breakable. I thanked her. I thought about Ruth sitting in an attorney's office to undo something her parents had built. And I felt something that surprised me, not anger, not even hurt, exhaustion, the deep kind. Alan called me on a Wednesday, 11 days after the dinner, not Timothy, me. He said he'd been thinking. He said he wanted to meet for coffee, just the two of us. He said there were things he wanted to say in person, and he wasn't good at saying them on the phone. We met on a Friday at a coffee shop on Market Street, a place we used to go when he was in college and would visit for weekends. He was already there when I arrived. He'd ordered my usual without asking, which meant he'd remembered, and the small mercy of that made me love him all over again, even in the middle of all this. He looked tired. There were circles under his eyes I hadn't noticed at dinner. "Mom," he said when I sat down, "I've been going over everything and I need to be honest with you." I waited. "I've been thinking about money for as long as I can remember. Since I was in my 20s, what you and Dad had, what might come down eventually. And I told myself it wasn't like that. I told myself I was just being practical, thinking about the future, taking care of myself." He looked at the table. "But when you called and said you were broke, the first thing I thought about was the life insurance. I'm ashamed of that." I held my coffee with both hands. "I'm not going to make excuses," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I heard what Dad said, all of it. And," I said, he looked up, "and I want to be different than what I showed you that month. I don't know if you can trust that right away. I'm not asking you to. I just needed to say it. This is what I know about Alan. He has always needed more time than other people to arrive at his own truth. He goes quiet, turns inward, comes out weeks later with something real. It's always been his way. I had learned to wait for it, and here it was. "I hear you," I said. "That's enough for today." We finished our coffee. He paid for mine without making it a thing. We hugged at the door. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't trust restored. But it was a beginning, the kind that comes from someone being honest without an audience. Ruth was harder. She called me 2 weeks later. Her voice had the particular quality it gets when she's been rehearsing, smooth, reasonable, a little too composed to be spontaneous. She said she understood the situation now that she'd had time to think. She said she and Craig had talked it over. She said she thought Timothy's approach had been a little extreme, but she could understand where it was coming from. "I just hope," she said, "that this doesn't change things. I hope we can still be a family." "We are still a family," I said. Good. A small pause. "And just so you know, if you and Dad ever do want to reconsider the structure of the trust at some point, you can always." "We won't," I said. Silence. "Okay," Ruth said. "Of course Ruth." I kept my voice even. "I love you. You're my daughter and that will never change, but the trust is not going to be part of our conversation. Not now, not later. Can you accept that?" Another pause, this one longer. "Yes," she said finally, and then quietly, "I'm sorry, Mom, for what Dad read at that table. I didn't like hearing it, but I know it was true." That surprised me. Ruth does not apologize easily. She has never apologized easily, even as a small girl. She would rather go to her room for an hour and come back acting normally than say the words out loud. So this cost her something. "I know it was hard to hear," I said. "It was," she said. "It really was." We talked for another 10 minutes about Craig, about their son's little league season, about nothing consequential. But there was something different in the texture of it. Lighter maybe, less performance. Susan, as she had promised on the porch, was doing the work. She called every few days, not with requests, just to talk. She asked how I was sleeping. She drove over one Saturday with Lily and a pot of vegetable soup, and we sat in the kitchen together for 3 hours doing nothing in particular. She didn't bring up the trust. She didn't bring up Derek's question about assisted living. She brought soup, she brought Lily. She showed up. I'm not saying she transformed overnight. She is still Susan, still occasionally scattered, still working through years of patterns that don't change in a month. But she was trying. And trying, when you're starting from an honest place, is different from performing. Timothy watched all of this with his usual patience. One evening I asked him, "Are you satisfied? Was this what you hoped for?" He thought about it. "I didn't hope for any particular outcome," he said. "I hoped for the truth. We got it. What each of them does with it now, that's their work to do, not ours." He went back to his book. I sat beside him and thought about that. Truth is the beginning of everything, even the painful things, even the hard conversations, even the nights at the kitchen table when you see someone clearly for the first time and you have to decide what to do next. We had the truth now. All of us, and something could finally be built from it, or not. That was their choice to make. It was a quiet Sunday morning in November, 2 months after the dinner, when Timothy finally told me the whole story. The part I hadn't known. We were at the kitchen table. Outside, the last of the leaves were down, the yard bare and clean-looking the way it gets in early November when everything has let go. I had made scrambled eggs. Timothy had made the toast. We've divided breakfast that way for decades without ever deciding to. He set down his coffee and said, "There's something I want to tell you about why I was so certain." I looked at him. "Do you remember when I had that heart event?" he said. "The episode in 2011. I remembered. He'd woken at 3 in the morning with what he described as pressure across his chest, and we'd driven to the UVA Medical Center and spent 6 hours in the emergency department while cardiologists ran tests. It turned out to be a significant arrhythmia, not a heart attack, but serious enough that Dr. Peterson had sat us down and used the word monitoring and the phrase going forward. Timothy was 56 years old. It frightened us both more than we said out loud. "I remember," I said. "The children came to the hospital that morning." He looked at his toast. "You were there, you saw them." I had been there. All three had come, Ruth straight from work still in her blazer, Alan driving 2 hours from Roanoke, Susan with Lily, who was only a baby at the time, in a car seat in the back. "They came because they love you," I said. "They did," he said, "and I was glad to see them. I was scared that morning, Nancy. I'd be a liar if I said otherwise." He paused, "But here is what I remember. When Dr. Peterson came in and told us the arrhythmia wasn't a heart attack, that it was serious but manageable, I watched each of their faces. I waited. Ruth," he said, "asked about the life insurance, right there in the hospital room. She said, 'Dad, we should talk about whether your coverage is still adequate.' She said it like it was practical, like she was just being responsible. And maybe that was part of it, but that was her first question when she found out her father was going to be all right." He picked up his coffee. "Alan asked about the pension, whether it would transfer to you if something happened to me. Again, reasonable on the surface, but this was within the hour of learning I wasn't dying. And Susan," I said, "Susan asked if we'd thought about the house, whether it made sense going forward for us to be in a house that size." He looked at me. "She meant, will you eventually downsize and what happens to the equity?" I sat with that. "I was lying in that hospital bed," Timothy said, "and my children were doing estate planning." The November sun came through the kitchen window. The bare oak in the backyard stood still in the cold air. "I didn't say anything then," he said, "because I could have been wrong. People say strange things when they're scared. People ask practical questions because the emotional ones are too big. I gave them the benefit of every doubt I could find." He turned the coffee cup slowly in both hands, but I started watching from that day forward. I kept the records. I tracked what was asked and when and what came before and after. And what I found over 12 years was a pattern, not occasional thoughtlessness. A pattern. Every financial request from this family came wrapped in emotion, and every piece of generosity from us was absorbed without acknowledgement and followed within months by another request. No one ever said, "That's enough." No one ever said, "I want to give something back." No one asked how we were doing when we weren't the answer to their problems. He finished his coffee and set the mug down. "I don't blame them entirely," he said. "We let it happen. We are not innocent in this. We said yes when we should have said no. We handed over money that came wrapped in love, and that made it feel like love to them too. It became the shape of our relationship, and we built that shape as much as they did." I thought about the yellow legal paper, the 12 years of line items. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" I said, not accusing, asking, genuinely. He looked at me with that steady gaze that I have loved and occasionally been maddened by for 44 years. "Because you would have been hurt," he said. "And when you're hurt, Nancy, you protect the people who caused the hurt. That's who you are. You would have made excuses for them. You would have talked yourself out of seeing it. I needed you to see it yourself in your own time in a way you couldn't talk yourself out of." He was right. He was completely right, and he knew it, and I knew it, and neither of us needed to say so. "I waited until we had the money safely in hand," he said, "until there was nothing left to risk. And then I asked you to make the calls." I looked out at the oak tree. One branch moved slightly, though I couldn't feel any wind through the glass. "Are you glad you know?" he asked. I thought about Ruth at the attorney's office. Alan's life insurance question, Susan and the grocery deposit, the group chat, the furniture scanning eyes, Derek asking about assisted living within 7 minutes of arriving. And then I thought about Lily and the chamomile tea and the pot of yellow mums and the question, "Are you scared?" "Yes," I said. "I'm glad I know all of it." Timothy nodded. "Knowledge is never the problem," he said. "It's what you choose to do with it." He got up and put his plate in the sink and went to find his reading glasses. I sat at the kitchen table a few minutes longer. The November light moved slowly across the floor. Timothy had given me a gift 12 years in the making, not the money, not the trust, not the legal protection. The gift was the truth, given at the right time in the right way with 44 years of patience behind it. That is what it means to be loved by a man who is genuinely wise, not that he saves you from hard things, but that he makes sure when the hard things come, you are ready to see them clearly. We moved to Asheville, North Carolina in January, not in crisis, on purpose. Timothy had been looking at the area quietly for 2 years, the way he looks at most things he cares about, steadily, without announcing. When the estate sold and the trust was structured and the dinner was over and the fallout had settled into something we could see the shape of, he showed me the listing. A house on a wooded lot at the edge of Kenilworth, a neighborhood in Asheville where the streets curve and the trees are old and the houses have porches that actually get used. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen with a good window over the sink, and a screened back porch with a view of the mountain ridgeline that turns gold in the late afternoon. It was a third the size of our house on Sycamore Ridge Road. It was exactly enough. We moved in on a cold January morning with the help of a crew Timothy had arranged, professional, efficient, done by 3 in the afternoon. We didn't ask the children to help, not because we were punishing them, but because this move wasn't theirs to be part of. This house was ours. Carol Whitmore came to say goodbye the evening before we left Virginia. She stood on the old porch in her winter coat and hugged me for a long time. She handed me a card with her phone number and her email, both, and said, "Don't you dare disappear." I told her I wasn't going anywhere that mattered. She laughed and told me to call her when the mountains got to be too much for a girl who grew up in the flatlands. I told her I'd lived in Virginia my whole life and Virginia has mountains too. She said, "You know what I mean." I did. Our first morning in Asheville, I stood on the screened porch with my coffee and watched the ridgeline come into focus through the morning fog. Timothy came out in his slippers. He always forgets slippers exist until the floor is cold, and stood beside me. We didn't talk. We don't always need to. After 44 years, silence with someone you love is its own language. We planted a garden in March, not the production it was at Sycamore Ridge, no half-acre, no elaborate beds, no landscaping company. Just a raised bed along the sunny side of the house. Tomatoes, herbs, zucchini that always grows too much, sunflowers at the back because Timothy likes sunflowers and never once planted them on Sycamore Ridge Road because there was never quite the right spot. Here there was. I found a book club at the Kenilworth Branch Library, 8 women who meet every 3rd Thursday and take the reading seriously and the wine even more seriously. Our host, Diane Prescott, is 70 and has lived in Asheville her whole life and knows where everything is and is glad to tell you. Her friend Margaret, 68, is a retired cardiac nurse who laughs at things that aren't supposed to be funny and is always right that they are. I had not had friends like this in years, not the kind who don't want anything from you. I didn't realize until Asheville how much of my social life in Virginia had been built around managing the image of our family. Keeping up the right appearances at the right events with the right people who knew Ruth's job and Alan's address and Susan's Instagram, and who asked about them in a way that felt like social accounting. In Asheville, nobody knows my children. Nobody asks. I am Nancy Best, 67, who moved here from Virginia with her husband and likes chamomile tea and is slightly better at growing tomatoes than sunflowers. That's all. It's enough. It's more than enough. Timothy joined a woodworking shop downtown, a community maker space where retired engineers and hobbyists share tools and projects and opinions. He goes on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He comes home smelling like sawdust and looking more peaceful than I've seen him in 10 years. He is building a bench for the screened porch. He's been at it for 6 weeks. He says it should be done by summer, about the children. Ruth has called 3 times since we moved. 2 of those calls were good, genuine conversation. How's the house? How's the book club? Did Timothy really join a woodworking class? The 3rd call looped back, carefully, toward whether we'd considered any charitable giving structures that might have estate planning benefits. I told her gently and firmly that we'd handled our estate planning. We talked about her son's little league season for the rest of the call. Progress is not a straight line, I know that. Alan drove down in April to see the house. He brought Melissa, who I liked immediately. She has a directness and a warmth that I think is good for him. He helped Timothy move some boxes that had been sitting in the wrong room since January. He didn't look at the furniture. He made me laugh twice at dinner. I'm watching. I'm still watching. But I have more hope for Alan than I expected. Susan visits with Lily, sometimes together and sometimes separately. Lily has become the kind of regular presence in my life that I didn't know I needed. She called in February when she found out she'd been accepted to NC State for engineering. She called me before she called her own parents, she said, because she wanted to tell someone she knew would only be happy for her, no calculations, no complications. I cried. I told her she was exactly right. The trust holds Lily's education fund, $50,000, accessible only for tuition and school expenses. Her name is on it, her mother's is not. That was Timothy's note made the evening Lily brought the chamomile tea and the sourdough bread and sat at the kitchen table and asked if we were scared. He had written her name down that night. He had not forgotten. I want to talk to you directly now. If you've watched this far, and you have, it's because some part of this story is your story too. Maybe not the numbers. Maybe not the estate or the attorney's office or the Sunday dinner, but the feeling of being loved when something was being taken from you and questioned when you had nothing left to give. If you are in a season of your life where you are wondering whether the people around you love you or love what you provide, I want to tell you that the question itself is not disloyal. Asking it is not a betrayal of your family. Seeing clearly is not the same as stopping love. You can love your children completely and still protect yourself from their worst instincts. You can forgive someone and still structure a trust that keeps them from accessing what they haven't earned. Forgiveness and wisdom are not opposites. Timothy spent 12 years keeping records not because he is cold. This man teared up at Lily's college acceptance call, sitting in his woodworking shop with sawdust on his hands, but because he understood something that took me longer to learn. Love without discernment is not love. It is exhaustion wearing love's clothing. You are allowed to be discerning. You are allowed to say, I love you and I also see you clearly, and what I see means I have to protect myself and my future. You are 65, 70, 75 years old. You have spent your whole life being responsible, being the soft place everyone else fell, writing the checks and making the calls and showing up when no one showed up for you. You are allowed, you are entitled to build the rest of your life on a different foundation, not a smaller life, a cleaner one that belongs to you. We have our mountain view and Timothy's sunflowers and the screened porch where we sit in the evening and say nothing because nothing needs to be said. We have Carol calling from Virginia and Diane's book club on Thursdays and Lily's texts that come out of nowhere and always make me smile. We have each other, which is the thing we've always had and which turned out, when everything else was stripped away, to be the only thing that was always real. The morning light comes through the kitchen window here the same way it came through the one in Virginia. Different window, same light. I think about that. The light follows you. It always has. You just have to walk toward it. That's my story. If it felt like yours, I'm glad you stayed until the end. Drop a comment and tell me, what would you do if you had to start over at 65, 67, 70, and what would you do differently? And if you want more stories like this, real women, real decisions, real lives, there are 2 more waiting for you right below. Subscribe if you haven't. You are not alone. You never